These elegant swan cards started with a few simple techniques you can use with a variety of supplies in your craft room. Today I'm creating two completely different cards with these beautiful swans. One soft and romantic and one with a more dramatic feel. I'll show you how I made a few little design decisions that helped bring these cards to life. And if you watched my last couture card video, you may remember I mentioned that I had a few creative struggles behind the scenes. Well, I saved those bloopers for today because apparently making elegant cards doesn't always look quite as elegant while you're creating them. Let's dive in. Before we get into assembling the cards, I want to show you the pieces I've already prepared and share a few things I'm doing to give these swans a little more character. For both cards, I'm starting with fog cardstock for the swans. I decided to use a soft gray rather than bright white since I'm filming and details get lost on bright white. You can absolutely go with bright white if you aren't creating on camera. Whenever I'm working with detailed die cuts, I like to think about where the light would naturally hit the object. Even something as simple as adding a little shading can make a huge difference because it helps separate the layers and gives the piece more dimension. I'll be doing some very subtle ink blending with Lost Shadow Distress Oxiding. And when I say subtle, I really mean subtle. We are not trying to turn these swans into storm clouds. I'm just adding a little bit of shading along one side to create a shadow area. Since these two swans will be facing each other, I want the light source to feel consistent, so the shadows will fall in the same direction, just mirrored. For the details like the eyes and beaks, I die cut those from white cardstock and used a marker to add the color. Tiny die cuts are beautiful, but they are also experts at disappearing the moment you need them, so I always try to prepare a few extras whenever possible. For the decorative pieces, the dies are very detailed. I'm also going to add a little bit of shading to the accessories. And they actually include etched guides, which make assembling them much easier. I love when a die set does some of the thinking for you because it lets you focus more on the creative decisions rather than trying to figure out where every little piece belongs. And of course, a little jewel picker is my best friend for pieces this tiny. Honestly, I don't know how many times I've dropped tiny die cuts on my craft desk and then spent 5 minutes searching for something smaller than a grain of rice. Crafting definitely builds patience. For the female swan, I'm adding a little bit of pink shading to the details. I wanted to keep the color palette soft, so I'm just adding a touch of kitsch flamingo around the edges. I'm not trying to create a dramatic color change here. The goal is simply to add enough variation that the layers separate and the details become visible. Once all the little pieces are assembled, these swans really start to come together. And this is why I love working with detailed die sets. Sometimes the magic isn't in one big element, it's in all those tiny details that slowly build into something special. For this first card, I'm creating a soft romantic scene for an anniversary card with these swans facing each other. I wanted the design to feel almost like a beautiful Swan Lake moment. Elegant, peaceful, loving, and a little bit whimsical. I'm using a 5x7 card base today because, as you probably know by now, I love having that extra space to build a scene. It gives me so much more room to play with layers and details. There's one more bit of ink blending I want to do before we start assembling the card. I'm using the strip across the front to anchor the swans, but I don't want it to be just a solid block of color. Normally we think about ink blending darker colors onto white cardstock. This time I'm flipping that idea around. I'm starting with colored cardstock and using white pigment ink to create a soft gradient. It's a really simple technique, but it adds so much depth and gives the strip a much softer look. I don't need the entire piece, so I'll give it a rough trim first. And now I'll bring in my white pigment ink. I'm going to start fairly heavy on the right-hand side and then gradually lighten my pressure as I blend toward the center. I'm not looking for a harsh line. I just want a nice smooth transition from light back to the original cardstock color. It looks quite dramatic right now, especially on camera, but don't worry. White pigment ink always softens as it dries, so the finished result will be much more subtle. I'm just taking my time to smooth out that blend. I think that's looking good, so I'll set this aside for a few minutes to dry, and then we can start putting the card together. I'll be combining the swans with this beautiful haberdashery buttons embossing folder to create the background. And I'm using a soft mint cardstock because I think it gives the card a really fresh, almost spring-like feel. To anchor the focal point, I'm going with a darker indigo strip across the card. This also gives the swans a little more contrast against that soft embossed background. I've cut my mint cardstock slightly larger than my final 5x7 card, but I'll trim it down at the end. I like to have that little extra margin just in case the embossing doesn't go as planned. Before embossing, I lightly mist the cardstock. This helps soften the fibers just enough so the embossing folder can create a deeper, more detailed impression. And this is why I always tell myself, don't skip the little preparation steps. They may seem unnecessary, but they can make such a difference in the final result. Look at this. Isn't that embossing gorgeous? The texture is beautiful on its own, but I wanted to take it one step further by adding just a little extra interest. If you watched my couture dress forms video, remember those little buttons I created with this embossing folder? Well, now I'll use the negative die cut like a mask since it's already covered in packing tape. I'll add some white pigment ink through the mask to some of the largest embossed circles. This creates a soft spotlight effect and gives the background a little more interest without overpowering the embossing. And this is one of my favorite things about crafting. Sometimes you can take something designed for one purpose and use it in a completely different way. A negative die cut doesn't always have to go into your trash or recycling. Sometimes it's tempting to keep adding more and more details, but knowing when to stop is also part of the design process. And I think this is enough. Now I'll add my darker cardstock strip across the center at an angle because that would be more dynamic than having it sit straight. This will give the swans some water to sit on, so to speak, and create that nice contrast. I'm adding this with foam tape because if you watched my videos before, you already know I love dimension. Flat cards are beautiful too, but there's something about lifting elements up and creating those little shadows that makes a card feel almost like a tiny scene. And now it's time for the fun part, arranging the swans. I always think this is the moment where the card either suddenly comes together or completely changes direction. Sometimes I have a very clear vision in my head, and sometimes my crafty brain basically doesn't follow in that direction and says, nope, we're doing something else today. I'll place the swan couple facing each other because that creates a natural connection between them. When you have two focal images, having them interact with each other helps tell a story rather than making them feel like separate elements sitting on the card. I'm adding foam tape behind the swans as well to continue that layered look. For the head area, I'm doubling up the foam tape slightly because the neck extends away from the raised background and needs extra support. This is one of those little things that make a big difference. You want dimension, but you also want your delicate pieces to stay supported. And now they're ready to go on the card. Look at how pretty they are together. I love how soft and elegant this feels. The swans, the embossing, and the color palette all work together without competing for attention. Now, before I finish the card, I need to decide on the sentiment placement. I think this area works better because it balances the composition and leaves the swans as the main focal point. I'll add a few opal gems for a little sparkle and stamp Happy Anniversary inside. And that completes the first card. I really love how this turned out because it has that peaceful, almost storybook feeling. But I wasn't finished with this collection yet. For the second card, I want to take one of the swans and create something with a completely different personality. The first card had a soft romantic feel, but this one is going to be a little bit more dramatic but elegant. Same swan, and I'm creating more of a framed portrait effect. I'm using this beautiful indigo cardstock again as the backdrop, and I created an archish shape using oval dies. I don't actually have a plain arch die in my stash, and I didn't want the stitch details, so I decided to improvise. And honestly, some of the best card ideas come from those moments where you're forced to look at your supplies a little differently and figure out how to make it work. And if the half-baked oval is bothering you, it won't for long. Just wait for it to get cut down to size. I created a silver frame using 2 nesting dies that are 2 consecutive sizes larger than the arch for a touch of elegance. For the background, I'm using this pale blue panel created with the same haberdashery buttons embossing folder because I wanted something subtle that would add texture without competing with the focal point. Texture is one of those design elements that can sometimes be overlooked. Even when it's not the first thing you notice, it creates depth and makes the card feel more finished. I've also prepared another swan and some florals and foliage, but this time I used minimal inking and used a deeper shade of pink for the frill details because I wanted this one to feel a little bolder. I assembled the swan off camera since you've seen me do that twice already, and now I only need to add it inside the frame. The nice thing about detailed dies like this is that once you've assembled one, the second one goes much faster because you already know where everything belongs. Although I will say that tiny die cuts always have a way of keeping you humble. They're beautiful, but they definitely test your patience. Once the swan is in place, I'll add some flowers on the other corner to cover the base. These are actually from a completely different die set, but I thought they worked beautifully here. And this is another design principle I often use. Don't feel like you have to keep collections separate. Mixing and matching your supplies is where you can create something that feels uniquely yours. I'm arranging the flowers around the swan to create a little garden scene. I want the flowers to frame the focal point rather than overwhelm it. And if you're looking for the card measurements and the list of supplies, I have them all listed in my blog post, which is linked in the video description. And as always, I'll use press and seal to pick up my arrangement before gluing everything down. That little trick has saved me so many times, because there is nothing worse than spending 10 minutes arranging tiny pieces perfectly and then accidentally moving one little leaf and suddenly the entire composition looks different. Ask me how I know. Actually, don't. You've probably seen enough of my crafting struggles already. Now I'm adding a few foam squares behind some of the flowers to create different levels of dimension. Not everything needs to be raised, but having a combination of flat and dimensional elements creates more movement. And finally, I'm adding the sentiment inside the arch. I love how the shape naturally draws your eye toward the center of the card. A little sparkle with some gems, and this card is complete. Now I have to show you something, because this video almost became a completely different story. Remember earlier when I said sometimes my crafty brain has its own plans? Well, this card definitely tested me. I had one of those moments where I thought, oh no, I may have just ruined this. And for a few minutes, I was very seriously considering starting over. But instead, I decided to see if I could rescue it. And this is honestly one of the most useful things we can learn as card makers. Not every mistake means the project is over. Sometimes you just need to pause, look at the problem differently, and find another solution. So here's what happened to that first card. Actually, make it 3 things. I stuck the swan too far in the center, which meant the second swan wouldn't have room. That's an easy fix with the heat tool since I used foam tape. Heating it releases the glue, and it's easy to reposition it. Next one was another huge blunder, which was that I completely forgot to cut the panel down to fit the card base before adhering the die cuts, which meant the design would be completely off. But I managed to trim it down to size without losing the main plot completely. And the third thing was forgetting to add silver strips that I'd mentally planned to add to the edges of the dark blue band. I couldn't do that over. And somehow, after a little creative problem solving, I managed to save the card. And I'm actually glad it happened, because these moments are where we learn the most. And I'm sure you're also having a good laugh over it. Perfect cards are wonderful, but figuring out how to recover when things go wrong is a skill every crafter needs. My brain definitely had a mind of its own that day. That's one of my favorite things about card making. The supplies are only the starting point. The real creativity comes from the choices we make. The colors, the textures, the layers, and even the little unexpected moments along the way. And if you enjoy making soft, romantic, and elegant cards, have you considered ways to incorporate vellum into your card making? Also, if you enjoy watching the creative process, including the mistakes, the problem solving, and the happy accidents, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss my videos, because they all have them.